We're really going to have some fun here, painting Wetty and Wet Poppies. We're going to be using bright cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and we're going to have a wet and wet background using some blue as well. I'm just going to start now by placing the flower centres. All I'm doing is placing the centres so that I can see where to apply the paint. And the centres need to be about as big as your little fingernail. Normally I would do this just using water, but so that you can see what I'm doing, I've got a little bit of red paint in it, and I'm just going to paint rough flower shapes around these centres. Nice and wet. What I don't want you to do is paint poppy shapes. I just want ragged, wetty and wet shapes, because when you get the black centres in, that will really make them look like poppies anyway. And if they run together, it really doesn't matter at all. Now, while that's still wet, I'm going to drop in some very bright, strong cadmium red. And I'm not painting it in, I'm dropping it in, and I'm letting it run and do its own thing. Again, I'm not painting poppies, I'm just dropping paint into these wet shapes. And I'm going to drop in some cadmium yellow. This will help to make the poppies nice and bright. If the poppies start to dry a little bit, you might need to coax the colour into the red. But mine is still quite wet, so it's running in quite freely. And I need to let these dry just a little bit before I start adding the centres. I'm going to drop in some of the Payne's Grey around the centre of the flowers now. I'm using Payne's Grey. You can use black or you can use a dark purple, but if you're going to use a dark colour, make it dark, not a wishy-washy grey colour. You want nice crisp centres to these flowers. And I'm just going to touch around the edge of that wet paint. It's still very wet here and there. And the wetter the paint is, the more it's going to run into the flower. I've gone over the centre as well. And while it's still nice and wet, I'm just going to take my tissue over the end of my index finger and just press once where that flower centre was. That's spreading beautifully around there. If when you do this for the first time you find that the black spreads too much and it tends to take over the whole of your flower, just start another one. They don't really take very long to do. That has spread rather a long way because the flower is really quite wet. I don't really want it to go any further than that if I can help it. Do the centre. I'll just do these other three. There, where the paint has dried completely, where the red and the yellow has completely dried, the paint hasn't spread at all, but that doesn't matter. You don't want them to look all exactly the same. And the little one up here last of all. Oh, that's spreading beautifully. Just right. And I'll just take the little centre out. Right, now I've painted most of the flowers. I'm going to add some background around now, and I'm going to use my very big brush. Lots of lovely wetty and wet background. I'm going to start with some yellow. And if it runs into the flowers, it doesn't matter at all. Now I'm going to come in with the blue. And where it's mixed with the yellow on my brush, it's gone a lovely sort of greeny grey colour, which is nice. I'm just going to pull that little wet bit down there. It's a bit too wet, just into the flower. And it's quite nice if you leave one or two little bits of white showing around the flowers. It will give your painting quite a nice sparkle. And it seems to add to the general wetty and wet abstract design quite nicely. I'm just going to turn my board around now so that it will make it easier for me to do the other side. When you're doing these wetty and wet backgrounds, it's a good idea to have your board so that you can move it. And this allows all of the background colours to run together. I don't like to work with a board that is too static. I'm going to come in with some yellow up here and just join up with that little bit of yellow that we had there. And the red is running there, that's absolutely fine. Nice and wet. I'm going to let this completely dry now before we go on to the next stage.